Hey guys, good evening. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We're having a little bit of issues with connectivity here. So I don't know how well this live stream is
Hey
going
guys,
to come
good
through.
evening. Hopefully you
Got to turn down the volume on my phone before I started. So this is a little rushed together only because this is not something I was planning on doing today, but I felt like events taking place in Syria were consequential enough that it was worth having a conversation today, sitting down and talking through. Some of the things that have happened over the last, glad to see that things are okay. Um, Thought it was worth taking a few minutes this evening to sit down and talk through some of the things that are going on in the Middle East. So sorry I didn't get my hair and makeup done before the live stream, but you'll just have to take me as I am, and we can start talking about. I would say this is probably the most consequential event to take place in the Middle East, definitely since October 7th. Um, and this is just the latest event to kind of send this is going to be one of those things that sends out shockwaves and ripples across not just the region but the world. um, I alluded to this. We alluded to this on Twitter over the past 24 hours or so as we saw rebel groups just basically driving into Damascus unopposed. I mean, we were expecting at each turn, beginning with Aleppo, and then Hama, and then Homs, and then Damascus, and then Latakia even has now fallen without a fight. And each time we're thinking, when is the regime going to make a last stand? And they just kind of never did. Um, and I can't say that that wasn't because Bashar al-Assad and his top leadership didn't want to, but just I'd say the top echelon of the Syrian Arab Army, the SSA, just began to melt away in the face of the HTS advance, and then you had the rebels in Daraa in southwest Syria that started to advance up towards Damascus, and they were the ones actually to reach Damascus first, which I felt was really fitting. I'm glad they got there first because those are the rebel groups that FAI worked with in southwest Syria. Very much cut from a different cloth than HTS and the SNA in the north. So I was really glad to see that they were the ones that make it to Damascus first. They deserve it, but they're by no means even close to being the most powerful rebel group in Syria. That is most definitely at this hour anyway. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. We talked about him a little bit last time in the last live stream and also on Twitter. Very interesting person, very well spoken, a quote unquote reformed jihadist. We'll talk about him in a little bit, but in the meantime, I just kind of want to just collect our thoughts here and get a sense of where we're at. So I'm going to switch again over to the map, and you guys can kind of see where we are. This, by the way, shameless plug for an app that we use here in FAI that you can use. It's called liveuamap.com. They also have a mobile app. And the really cool thing about this service, if I switch over here, is that you can see there's a map of Syria here, and they have kind of the color-coded areas of control throughout the country, and I'll explain the color coding in a minute. And then you can see all these little dots, color-coded dots with different icons throughout the country. And if you click on any one of these, it'll go to the tweet or the post, I guess now it is an X, that is associated, and I have the free version, so unfortunately I'm loaded up with all kinds of apps that just kind of like show me ads for anything that I might have Googled recently. But if you can manage scrolling through that, then you'll kind of see the tweets that are associated with the whatever it is that happened in that area. So the cool thing about this app is it kind of geolocates the tweets. you can see an icon here, and if I click on the icon, it'll take me to a tweet, and if I click on source, then it'll open up Twitter, and it'll show me the tweet for that icon. So this is one of the resources we use, especially right now when there's just a million things going on. In Syria, and the map is just, you can see, this is like Damascus. You can just see a mess of things going on down here. This is Latakia, right here on the coast, and Tartus, we were talking about that. That's the Alawite homeland yesterday. And then the color coding, I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. The color coding is green is rebel-held territory, and yellow is Kurdish SDF-held territory, and this kind of like lighter green, gray, I don't know. My wife says I'm colorblind, so I don't really know what color this is. But you can see this strip right here, and then over here in Afrin, that is territory that's held by Turkish-backed rebels, which are the Syrian National Army, and they're kind of a different animal altogether. So you can see the regime used to be red-colored. There is no more red on this map. Now, that's not to say that in reality the regime isn't still, the regime military isn't still operative in some parts of Syria. But if you were following the wire yesterday, you heard that for the most part, the Syrian High Command in Damascus sent out a message to all of the Syrian brigades throughout the country that the regime had fallen, that the war was over, and essentially telling them to stand down. Now, there's going to be a transition process here. And that's one of the things, the question is, Syria, what happens next? So one of the things that's going to happen next is now that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is in control of the government apparatus down here in Damascus, which is, I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer there, but you see Lebanon, and you see Israel there in the Golan Heights. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. And Damascus is right here, okay? So that is where most of the activity is happening. Also in the south, Kintaria, right here around the Golan Heights. Those are some of the more friendly rebel units. And when I say more friendly, there were some videos posted just yesterday of rebel units in this area. They were speaking to the Israeli people, saying that they wanted to have good relations with Israel, and that they even wanted Israelis and Israeli businesses to invest in this area of southwest Syria. This is the area of Syria where Israel operated between 2013 and 2018 for Operation Good Neighbor, and treated many of the people here either across the border or in government-sponsored medical clinics that FAI operated here in this general area. I'm not going to say exactly where, but in this general area. And had really good relations with Syrians there. And Syrians who had been raised all their lives to believe that the Jews were the enemy and wanted to kill their children and drain the blood out of their children for their Passover matzah, found out that the Jewish people actually are just human beings who wanted to live in their homeland like anybody else, who wanted to live peacefully there like anybody else, and who were just willing to defend their homeland like anybody else. And that really changed the perspective of a lot of Syrians in this area of southwest Syria. So interestingly, now that the regime has finally fallen, and these Daraa rebel groups, Daraa is a city right here, right near the Jordanian border, and there was a lot of rebel groups based there. In fact, this was the heartland of the civil war in the very beginning. A lot of these rebel groups are interested very much now in working with Israel. That's not to speak for HTS at all. Although al-Jolani, at least publicly, is talking a lot about reconciliation with different groups in Syria. There's these press releases that keep coming out that say we don't want to take revenge on anybody. We're not going to oppress any particular people group. The Alawites that Assad's family comes from, or the Druze or other people groups in Syria. We're not jihadists like ISIS. We're the new, tolerant, fashionable form of Islamists, And we want to build a new Syria where everybody is included and everybody has a voice and they all have the kind of their local councils that can govern themselves. And I'm sure this will eventually turn into something like a transitional government. We don't know exactly what form that'll take yet, but there will be a transitional government and potentially elections, much like what we saw in Iraq in 2003, 4, 5, 6, after Saddam's regime was annihilated basically by the U.S. military, and then you had elections and a transitional government, a transitional body that led to a new government in Iraq. Although this is different in Syria. This isn't being imposed by a foreign power like what happened in Iraq. This is a homegrown grassroots revolution. And there are external influences, Turkey and Iran and the United States and probably other Arab states are going to kind of crowd in to lend their voices to this process. But for the most part, right now, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani is the most powerful man, singular person in Syria. That's just shocking, guys, because 2 weeks ago, nobody knew who he was, unless you followed Syria closely. 2 weeks ago, this guy was a leader of the group that was ex-Al-Qaeda with a $10 million bounty on his head. Just 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks, he is now the foremost leading figure in the entire country of Syria and is being interviewed by CNN for their primetime broadcast and is working with the former regime prime minister, Assad's prime minister of his government, and is in negotiations with him about leading a new transitional government. That is, I mean, you can't, that is a shift, a plot twist that'll make your head spin. We've never seen anything like that. And so once again, the Middle East is the standard for unprecedented events in world history and has not failed to disappoint once again. So, or has not disappointed, I should say, once again. So we'll see what happens. This is going to be an interesting period here now in terms of how this plays out. A lot of it's going to have to do with how HTS and al-Jawlani cooperates with former regime personalities and figures that have remained in Syria. He's extended amnesty to the army. He's extended amnesty to former members of the regime and intended, or at least indicated his intention to work with them. So on the surface, that all looks very promising. And look, guys, Assad was a bad guy. This was an evil regime. Okay? Some of you saw the Sunawiya from the prison, the post that we shared just a little while ago. For about more than a decade now, Assad's regime has imprisoned, tortured, disappeared, murdered, raped, and pillaged across this entire country. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in his prison farm, and his torture factories across this country. Many of them are bad actors that should stay in prison, but most of them even are normal people who just oppose the regime for whatever reason, much in the same way that we've seen opposition to the regime in Iran for the past couple of years. And if you went out on the streets in Damascus or Homs or Aleppo and marched against the regime, you might have disappeared 5 or 10 years ago and are just now reappearing if you survived in these prisons. And you've got not just men, you've got entire families, women and children. There are levels to this prison, almost like Dante's Inferno. There are levels all the way down these prisons where the rebel groups that are going into these prisons, they can see the people on these cameras. They don't even know how to get to the rooms that they're in. That's how much of a gauntlet, of a dungeon these places are. And there's actually a very real humanitarian crisis right now where you've got tens of thousands of people literally buried in these prisons, and the rebel groups have no way to get to them, and they're just slowly dying. They don't have food or water. Um, so there's a very real element of this where there is some vindication in this victory. There's some justice here. There's a temptation to look at this and see it as a good thing. That Syria is being liberated from a very evil man and a very evil regime who is working with Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah and Vladimir Putin, and they had, you know, pillaged, raped, and murdered across Syria for 14 years now. And so there is this sense of euphoria that, and there's almost this temptation to think, you know, al-Jilani, yeah, he was Al-Qaeda, but if he's willing to be inclusive now, if he's willing to be kind of reformed, he's an older, wiser version of himself, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. I'm even I know this guy. I know this organization, going all the way back to Al-Nusra Front and his association with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and even knowing all that, even I'm tempted to want to believe that. Because you want to believe that Syria is going to have something better now. And you see how evil the regime was, and you want to believe that it's going to be a good thing moving forward. And even Bibi Netanyahu gave a press conference today and basically said, you know, we're cautiously optimistic about what's happening in Syria. And there's some nuances and some complications there that we'll talk about in a minute. But, you know, Israel, obviously, for very obvious reasons, has been very focused on the Iranian threat for the past decade. And the fact that Iran now no longer has any access to Israel through Lebanon, through Syria, they don't have the pipeline that ran from Tehran to Beirut, that ran from Tehran to the Golan Heights, is now cut off. That's a good thing. Let's not downplay that. That's a very good thing. Israel's most immediate threat in Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has now been fully mitigated. So that is something to be thankful for, I'd say, on one hand. Another thing to be thankful for in all of this is the vacuum that's being created by the absence of the regime is creating new opportunities for the Kurdish administration. All this yellow area up here is the Syrian Democratic Council, the AANES, Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, which is led by Kurds. This is the Kurdish, ethnically and religiously Kurdish majority area of Syria up here, the northern part of the yellow around the Turkish border. And so there was a while where the regime controlled the airport of Kamlishi, which is kind of like the Kurdish capital of Syria, right up here in the corner, near the Turkish and Iraqi borders, up in this right wing of Syria. The regime is withdrawn from that. So the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led militia, now controls an airport in Syria. That's amazing. That's awesome. That gives us a new way to access the Kurds of Syria. So that's a good thing. And the regime vacating all these areas west of the Euphrates River. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you can kind of see this river snaking through the middle of Syria here. That's the Euphrates River. So that used to be kind of the border of the Autonomous Administration Northeast Syria and the regime-held territory. You can see there's a lot of yellow now on the other side of the river. That is Kurdish gains, the SDF moving into this area since the regime has collapsed. So the Kurds now control more territory, which in our opinion is always a good thing. And they even control this kind of vital strategic artery here near the Iraqi border, Bukamal, Abu Gamal, Deir ez-Zor, all these areas here along the border. You can see there's some icons here where they have made some gains in the past few days. That's a good thing. There's even been rumors, and I don't know how true this is, but there's even been some talk about the fact that the SDF could make a break for it across Syria and create a land bridge between the autonomous area up here all the way down to either Jordan or possibly even Israel, so that the Israelis and Kurds could be connected by land. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the SDF behind the scenes is working with the HTS right now, with al-Jawlani's organization. Al-Jawlani has been rather magnanimous towards the Kurds and at least indicated that he wants to continue to give everybody their autonomy in Syria. So that would seem to indicate that nothing is going to change in the short term as far as he's concerned for the Kurds. But we have talked about this other animal up here in the north near the Turkish border. That is the Syrian National Army. That is the rebel group that has been trained and armed by the Turkish military. And their objective in Syria is much less about overthrowing the Assad regime and much more about taking territory from the Kurds in Syria. And so they have also kind of stepped into the ring. There's this kind of, I don't know if you watched WWE or WWF when you were a kid, and they had the Royal Rumbles, and everybody was kind of in the ring together, beating up on each other. And sometimes you had a few guys that were kind of in an alliance with each other, and other times it was just a free-for-all. Well, the SNA is just another one of the wrestlers in the ring in the Royal Rumble right now, and they have seen the opportunity to kind of step into this ring that is Syria and take as much as they can. And really where that is concentrated right now, you see kind of all of these icons concentrated around Manbij. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on Manbij. That's, you see this kind of yellow lip out here on to the west of the Euphrates River. That is Manbij, the city of Manbij and its surrounding environs. That is the last bastion of the autonomous administration of the Kurdish people to the west of the Euphrates River. This has been a target of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for years. For years he's talked about taking Manbij and other areas along the border to fight quote-unquote Kurdish terrorism. So it appears as though he's trying to use the SNA with support from the Turkish Air Force and Turkish artillery to push the Kurds across this river here, which is the Euphrates River, and take this territory. Manbij is kind of mixed Kurdish and Kurdish and Arab. So this is his next big target. Of course, he'll never be satisfied until he controls all of the territory that Kurds inhabit, and even more so. He's made it clear, and Erdogan's lackeys and his government and advisors have made it clear that they foresee a reconstituted Ottoman Empire that stretches beyond Aleppo in Syria and beyond Mosul in Iraq. That's what they want to see. So another possible scenario here is that the Turkish military takes advantage of the opportunity and the chaos in Syria to begin making gains southward towards Aleppo. Erdogan and al-Jawlani aren't on the best of terms. Technically, they're kind of on the same side, and he has at least tacitly, publicly had to endorse what they're doing. But they aren't his pet jihadis like the SNA. Jawlani is very much his own man. He has disavowed al-Qaeda. He's disavowed now Turkey. And he wants to act like the new populist leader of Syria and be his own man, at least publicly speaking. And that's kind of not the deal that Erdogan wants to make with the new leader of Syria. He wants Syria to be a vassal state. So this isn't, as I mentioned last time in the last live stream, Turkey's actually frozen the assets of HTS in Turkey. When Jawlani and his team were confined up to Idlib province right up here near Hatay in Turkey, the only way that the HTS could get anything into Syria was across the Turkish border. So Jawlani had to play with Turkey at that point in order to even get food into Idlib, let alone weapons and technology and that sort of thing. It's a different story now. Jawlani has control of seaports and airports and doesn't need the Turks anymore. He can start building his own country, literally. And so it's a different game now, a very different ball game for him. And Erdogan, although publicly, has to support him because, again, he's the champion of of Islam in the Middle East, or wants to portray himself that way anyway. Behind the scenes, he's not exactly elated about what's taking place in Syria right now. So, again, very interesting times. So that's what's happening on the Syrian and Kurdish front. Really quick for Assad. So there was some talk yesterday about Assad's plane taking off from Damascus towards Latakia. I'll zoom in on Latakia here so you can see it. It's this tiny sliver of red here. Actually, it's north of that. Latakia is right here, and there's this tiny sliver of regime-held territory. So there was reports of Assad's plane taking off and landing. The red is actually a Russian army base and naval base here around Tartus, which the Russians still control, and therefore the regime still controls. And so there's this report that he was flying here and then flying out of Syria, and that they were tracking his airplane, and suddenly his airplane made a sudden U-turn and descended very quickly, and then disappeared off of the radar. And there's reports that maybe Assad's plane had crashed and he was dead. That is most likely not true. It looks like today Ukrainian intelligence, which is very adept at with their sources inside the Russian government, have reported that that was simply disinformation, and that Assad and his family and his inner circle are now in Russia. So we haven't seen him emerge yet. I would expect, if he is still alive, which he probably is, that at some point he'll emerge as the leader of Syria in exile, and now he'll be the rebel. Right now he'll be the opposition, and but the fact is, Assad was very unpopular. Even among Alawites, he wasn't very popular. And so he is now going, I think, to finish out his days, however long they may be, in Russia or in Iran or wherever it may be, he and his family, in, I'm sure, a very posh apartment with all the amenities that one can want, but without a country to rule anymore. Good riddance. But he is probably still alive. So that is Bashar al-Assad. And the end of the Ba'ath Party rule, one of the last strong men in the Middle East. So, as I said, we'll see in the days and weeks ahead what comes of this transition process in Syria. I can expect we'll see some kind of elections. And I wouldn't be surprised to see al-Jilani emerge as whatever that position becomes, president or prime minister, whatever the head of state will be for the new Syria. Only because he is incredibly well spoken. He is the guy that really facilitated the demise of the regime. He's the guy in front of the cameras right now, and the guy with the story. And so I would expect that he will be the leader of Syria one way or another in the days and weeks ahead. And we'll see what happens with Israel. Really quick on the Israeli front, before I forget. So in blue here is the Golan Heights. To the west is Israel. To the east is Syria. And you can see there's some icons here about there's some activity. It's spicy down here, as we like to say. So there's been some activity here in the region. So there's an Israeli side of the Golan Heights, which is the majority of the Golan, and then there's a Syrian side of the Golan Heights, about 1/3 of the Golan. There is a demilitarized zone that this map doesn't really show it, but there's a DMZ or a buffer zone between Syria and Israel, just a few kilometers wide. On the Syrian side, there's the Alpha line, which is their border, and on the Israeli side, there's the Bravo line, which is their border. And nobody's supposed to be in between, or at least nobody with guns anyway, no militants. There's a UN observer force there, just like in southern Lebanon. They've been there since the mid-1970s, since the end of the Yom Kippur War, and they're supposed to be observing and reporting any nefarious activity going on there. So there were some rebel groups apparently that crossed into the demilitarized zone yesterday. The Israeli military apparently took action against them. I don't know what form that action took, whether they just yelled at him on loudspeakers or whether they fired some warning shots in the air or tried shelling him or what. But something happened, maybe some flyovers to give them a warning, and now apparently again it's kind of all quiet on the Western Front. But it is very tense. And Israel indicated to al-Jawlani and the rebel groups in the south that, hey, we're going to maintain the status quo here, so stay on your side of the DMZ. And that was kind of the deal, too, during Operation Good Neighbor, which is the very secret agreement that the Israeli military made with the rebels in southwestern Syria was, hey, you keep the border calm and peaceful, and we'll provide some services for you, some food relief and some medical relief. And that was kind of the deal that the Israeli military had with the rebels in southwest Syria for several years, and it worked actually pretty well. And that was the means by which the Lord gave us access, us being FAI, access to southwest Syria, and for field workers to go into southwest Syria for several years. It was actually, I'd call it miraculous, really. A group of Christian missionaries working with the Israeli military to minister to Muslims in Syria. One of the coolest stories in modern missions history. So, as far as I'm concerned anyway, but I'm a little biased. So, it looks like we're kind of back to that scenario now, where rebel groups are controlling the border with the Golan, and we're kind of feeling this out and figuring out how it's going to work. But hopefully, at least, everybody will respect the status quo and stay on their sides of the border. The Israeli military has apparently set up some outposts within the DMZ, but they're very clearly defensive in nature and observational in nature. And so, at least for the time being, it looks like all is quiet on the western front, southwestern front. So, that's where we're at. I wanted to take a few minutes as well before I take questions to talk through. So last time, the $1 million question was, is al-Jawlani the Antichrist? I can't answer, and as I mentioned, I can't answer that question, right? I can't, we can only really answer that question when that individual either leads the charge for or is a signatory of or affirms the covenant of 7 with Israel as described in Daniel chapter 9. So when that happens, we can say for sure that this man is that man, right? I don't know if al-Jawlani's that guy. I don't know if he's possibly a precursor to give us a kind of an idea of what he might look like, and he's going to come from somewhere else. There are some interesting things about him, and there's some problems with him. Right now, he's not friends with the Turkish government, and he has no influence over the Turkish government at all. So that is a problem. But he kind of interestingly fits some of the other, we'll say, qualities of that individual, of the King of the North. And so, again, I'm not saying he is one way or the other, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to go back to Daniel 11 and read through the first few verses of the passage that describe the final king of the north. So these are verses 21 through 23. And I thought it would be good to read through them and kind of get a sense of what are the qualities of this man who's going to arise somewhere in the region of Turkey, Syria, northern Iraq at some point. What is his rise to power going to look like? And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that we can say that we can identify him by these verses, that the identifying factor is when that treaty is signed. But we can look at these verses and say, this is probably what his rise to power is going to look like. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read these verses. I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical fulfillment of these verses, which for Daniel was a near-term future fulfillment because he was writing several years before the Seleucid Empire came to power, and how we might get some clues about a future eschatological fulfillment of these verses. Okay? So, not with anybody's name in mind, we're just looking at these verses and the qualities described in them. So the historical figure that fulfilled these verses was Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He was one of the Seleucid kings in the Greek Empire that ruled from Antioch, which if I go back, I'll go back to my map right now and show you guys Antioch. So if we zoom in here, I may be losing. Oh, there we go. If we zoom in here, oops. Hatay is here. Where's Antioch? I don't see it on this map, but Antioch, modern Antioch, or biblical Antioch, is in this region right here around Hatay. Okay, so this is where the king of the historical of the king of the north ruled from. This is where Antiochus's capital was in modern day Turkey. Idlib province, where all these Syrian rebels were holed up for about a decade, is right on the other side of the border. And Al-Jilani and HTS, there we go. Al-Jilani and HTS basically exploded out of this region here around Hatay, right on the other side of the Syrian border, and just went straight down the M5 highway here to Aleppo and Hama and Homs and to Damascus. Okay, so they literally came from the north, from the general region of Antioch, I guess you could say, towards Damascus. Okay, so the historical king of the north came from around Hatay in modern day Turkey. So going back to our verses, verse 21 says, "In his place shall arise a contemptible person," that is in place of the last king of the north, "shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given." Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, was not in the line of succession to rule over his empire. His nephew was. And he has kind of an interesting story. He was held hostage by the Roman Empire in Rome for many years and eventually released and went to Greece. And then after the death of his brother, since his nephew was too young to take the throne, he became a regent. And co-regent is what it's called with his nephew. And that is when the heir to the throne is too young to rule the country, and so you find a co-regent or a family member who can kind of take the throne with them and help them to rule temporarily until the younger regent is old enough to take over. That is the idea behind a regency. And oftentimes a queen, crown queen will be the regent, or another prince will be a regent on behalf of, a younger nephew or cousin or something like that. So Antiochus was only supposed to be a regent to his nephew and was supposed to relinquish power to his nephew eventually when the time came. He didn't, and eventually found an excuse to have his young nephew murdered and took the throne and became king over the Seleucid Empire. So in the near term, in the historical fulfillment, he was a man to whom royal majesty had not been given. He was not the rightful heir to the throne. Okay, so if we're looking forward to an eschatological fulfillment regarding this individual, he is not somebody who comes to power through the proper line of succession. Whether he politically shoehorns himself into power or takes power by force, or who knows what it is, He is not in the line. He's not the expected successor to the kingdom, whatever kingdom that may be. Okay? He kind of bursts onto the scene suddenly and takes power. Which leads us right into our next verse. He shall come in without warning, suddenly, quickly, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. He's going to be a good politician. He's going to be a good negotiator. He's going to make promises and tell people what they want to hear. He's going to flatter people. Okay? So he's not just a brute. He's not just an ISIS jihadist that goes around chopping heads off and scaring people. He's a savvy politician who knows when he needs to be tough and when he needs to show force and strike suddenly and decisively, but also when he needs to sit at the table and make deals. Okay? And this was very much the truth for Antiochus. He was a brutal guy, but he was also a very savvy politician. He learned a lot during his time, during his imprisonment in Rome. He learned from some of the best politicians in the world, in the Roman world at that time, and he learned how to be the leader of a country, not from his family, not from his time in his own, royal court, but literally from his time as a Roman prisoner. He observed the Roman consuls, the leaders of Rome. He observed the Roman Senate, and he learned what it meant to be a wheeler and dealer, a good, savvy politician in the ancient world. So we can expect to see much the same with this individual, whoever he is and whenever he rises, is that he will obtain the kingdom not only by force, but also by flattery. He'll be a good, savvy politician, and that he'll come in without warning. Suddenly, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken. Even the Prince of the Covenant. I'm not going to get into even the Prince of the Covenant aspect because that could be a whole teaching on its own. But I want to emphasize this phrase right here. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken. He's going to seem unstoppable. When he goes to war, look out. He'll sit at the table with you. He'll make deals with you. But if you oppose him, he's merciless. He's unstoppable. And really, if we're talking about an individual that rises in this particular part of the world, this is not Europe, guys. This is not North America or South America. This is the Middle East. And war is diplomacy. And you're not going to be revered or respected as a deliverer and a liberator unless you win some wars and show yourself to be a formidable military leader. Okay? So on one hand, he obtains the kingdom by flatteries. He's a very good politician. He's a slick individual. But on the other hand, he's a good military leader. And he can sweep armies away before him and break them. And earns the respect of those who follow him because of his military prowess. Okay. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. This individual is never sincere. He speaks sincerely. He acts sincerely. He maybe acts in a way that can appear convincing even to the leaders of the free world, the Western world, and Russia, China, other great powers of the world. Maybe he can even come across convincing to them. He's an idealistic person, but at the same time, he's a practical person. And he's somebody who can get stuff done, and make progress and make things happen. And so the way in which he acts seems genuine, but the scriptures tell us that from the time an alliance is made, we can talk about what that alliance will be, but from the time I would say he even begins to make alliances to come to power, he's acting deceitfully. He's not showing his cards. He's not showing his true colors. He's saying what he needs to say in order to gain power and accumulate power and build his empire and bide his time for what his ultimate goal is. And he shall become strong with a small people. Historically speaking, Antiochus made an alliance with a small Greek colony on the Turkish coast. And with that alliance, he gained a small army and a small group of very dedicated followers that allowed him to take control of the entire Seleucid Empire. So that was the historical fulfillment. So again, if we're applying this passage to the future king of the north, to the ultimate eschatological king of the north, it says, he shall become strong with a small people. He begins with a small faction. I don't know if that's a political party or a militia or both. We don't know what that's going to look like, or if we're even seeing it right now. But what we know is he's not going to just step into leadership of the greatest power that's kind of ruling over the region or over any particular country at that point. He's not going to be the chosen son. He's going to come out of nowhere, somebody to whom royal majesty has not been given. He's going to come in without warning, suddenly, and with his own political savvy, his own military prowess, he's going to become strong with a small people. With a small people, he's going to gain power and grow. So, anyway, I hope that's helpful. Again, it's hard to know how to apply it. I don't think we should use these verses to apply to anyone in particular now. I think these verses are going to be most helpful in hindsight when that 7-year covenant is made and this individual affirms that covenant. I think these will be verses that we read and interpret at that time, looking back and saying, yep, this is the guy, he checks all the boxes. But for now, we can use these as somewhat of a litmus test and say, we're looking for an individual who meets these qualifications. And if he does, then at the very least, I'd say he's somebody we cautiously pay attention to. Okay? And that, as Forrest Gump said, is all I'm going to say about that. So, if nothing else, I think this is a useful exercise because we're in a season of history where we are waiting, praying, and watching. Right? Active waiting. So we are waiting to see what's going to happen. We are watching to see what's happening, and we are praying and interceding into it. And really, this is an interesting exercise, and it's a fun exercise, but our mandate from the Lord, our commission, our job description as believers is to go and make disciples of all nations. And Matthew 24:14, one of our anchor verses here at FAI is, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That is to say, our work to be doing right now is to be taking the gospel to the unreached and unengaged. So although I think it's important to pay attention to these things, really ultimately our job right now is to be taking the good news of Jesus to places like Syria. And I think right now, some of the discernment that we can be practicing is to be looking at the ways that this massive sea change in the nation of Syria might be opening new, as Paul said, wide effectual doors for gospel labor in Syria. Syria is an unreached nation. There are people groups there that millions of people that have never heard about Jesus. And so the question we ask now is, how can we be reaching them? Because that's the work we ought to be doing. And the Lord will cause all the other things to play out in their time. But I think at the same time, we don't ignore the eschatological realities. We don't ignore what we see happening in the region, because it's a good reminder to us that we're close, guys. We're getting close. We're getting closer. And I don't know who this Al-Jilani dude is. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know what's going to happen in Syria, but it's a good reminder to us that we could be that close. And Jesus says, work while it is day, because night is coming when no one can work. There is a global night coming. And right now we're still in the daytime. The sun is setting, but it's still, I don't know, late afternoon, dusk, somewhere in there, globally speaking, in this age. And so as long as it is, as long as we still have time, as long as it's not midnight and the bridegroom hasn't showed up, it's still time to work and to get the work done. So that's what we're about. And again, God's put these, the Lord's put these things in Scripture. I think Daniel 11 is, for me anyway, is becoming more and more important as the days go ahead in terms of understanding the work of God in the region, understanding the eschatological scenario that we see unfolding before us. And we should understand it. We should pray into it and have our eyes open going into it. At the same time, that's not our work. Our work is sowing into the gospel of the kingdom to every tribe, nation, and language. So, that is my sermon for today. It's Sermon Sunday. So if you all have any questions, I have a few minutes here before I have to go. It's almost dinner time. So I'll take a few questions, and then, well, like I said, we'll have to do this again. If you asked a question earlier, please repost it. I'm not going to be able to scroll back up through everything, so go for it. Hit me with your best shot. Yes, there will be a recording later. All of these live streams are being recorded and will be available on YouTube. Good question. So like and share and subscribe, please, and share them with your friends. And speak a little bit about Israel on Mount Hermon this week, and if there are any prophetic markers related to Hermon. Good question. So for those of you that don't know, Mount Hermon is the tallest mountain in Israel, which isn't saying much. It's not that tall, but it is kind of in the northeast corner of the Golan Heights. It's right around the tri-state area of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Israel, I should say, not Lebanon. Israel has controlled the majority of Mount Hermon and the Golan Heights ever since 1967. That is a strategic area. It is an area that the Syrian military controlled prior to 1967, and from the Golan Heights shelled the Hula Valley and the lower Galilee below, shelled Israeli communities for a couple decades. So it's very important that Israel keeps the Golan Heights and Mount Hermon. That is geographically a strategic location. And so there are a couple of things that have happened around Hermon the past few days. There was at least one or two rebel units, I think, that started to ascend Mount Hermon and were warded off by the Israeli military. And so again, the Israeli strategy right now is maintaining status quo. You stay on your side of the fence. You stay behind the Alpha line. We'll stay behind the Bravo line, and everybody can get along. And we'll stay out of your conflict if you stay out of our territory. So there's no doubt that Israel will absolutely, that's non-negotiable. Israel will not negotiate any territory away to any regime in Syria, no matter what it is. You'll have to come take that by force. Do you think we could potentially see a unified caliphate between HTS Turkey factions in time? Erdogan's getting old, Al-Jilani and company are young and have time, assuming they survive. Yeah, potentially. This is the only thing that's certain in the Middle East is that nothing is certain. If you had told me that this would be happening in Syria 2 weeks ago, I would have told you you're crazy. But, again, that's the Middle East for you. So any number of things could happen in the coming weeks. And I look at Al-Jilani and I read those verses in Daniel 11. And I say, yeah, that looks, there's some parallels there. But there's a lot of unanswered questions there too, and there's a long ways to go. And again, we won't know for sure. Um, the prophetic marker that the Lord gave us in Daniel chapter 9 is that covenant sign for 1:7 that this little horn affirms, um, either because he's involved in negotiating it or because he signs on to it. And this covenant made for 1:7 gives Israel a sense of peace and security, that their enemies are finally subdued and they can finally become, as it says in Ezekiel 38, a land of unwalled villages and peace and safety, as it says in 2 Thessalonians. So I don't know if this is going to be the guy. He's promising peace, right? Um, could something happen with Turkey? Yes, Erdogan is getting old. There's always rumors about Erdogan being sick and having to relinquish power. Same thing with Putin. He's sick. It's a body double. You can see him shaking under the table, whatever it is. Erdogan was just recently elected last year. According to the Turkish constitution as it is now, his tenure as president of Turkey would be up in 5 years. Now, he's amended the constitution before, but he has made comments that he intends to step down in 5 years. And he is getting old. And there is no doubt he has handpicked successors. Some are talking about one of his sons or possibly others in the AK party that may take over for him. So no doubt he has a succession plan. Whether Al-Jilani would be the leader of such a confederacy, a 10-nation confederacy that Turkey would be a member of, and not the other way around, with Turkey leading that confederacy, that certainly wouldn't be Erdogan's preference. His preference would be to have a neo-Ottoman empire, a confederation of Islamic states, modern Islamic countries that form a neo-Ottoman empire. So still unsure how that's all going to shake out. And again, anything's possible. But yes, yeah, sure, that could happen. Gabe, do you think the Abraham Accords is the covenant? I don't think the first round was the covenant. That is the deal that was made with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and Sudan. Could some future iteration of the Abraham Accords become that 7-year covenant with Saudi Arabia? Possibly. But those are all states that Israel sort of works with behind the scenes anyway. I think that covenant, whether it's that covenant or some other initiative, whether it's Abraham Accords or something else, I think that 7-year covenant is going to have to be one that either Israel's enemies sign onto or in which they admit some sort of defeat and agree to leave Israel alone. Israel has to go into that 7-year period believing that they are secure. And a deal with Saudi Arabia is not the answer to that. It's a good step, but it's not the answer to that. Not with Turkey and Iran. I would say Syria, but now Syria is off the table. Not with Turkey and Iran still. So whatever that 7-year deal is, it's going to have to make Israel feel like it's secure, like there's no enemies out there that can immediately threaten it. Whether that means Iran's just, contained within its own borders and weakened, whether it means the regime falls. I don't see the Iranian regime as it is making a deal with Israel. Certainly not. But, that's TBD, to be determined. So I think it could be something. People have talked about the Cyrus Accords, for instance. Cyrus being the emperor of the Persian Empire that overcame the Babylonian Empire, that conquered Babylon, and that allowed the Jews to return to Judea and to rebuild the temple. He's actually referred to as a Moshiach, as a Messiah, as an anointed one in Scripture. Cyrus is. So Cyrus, obviously coming from Iran, from modern day Iran, from historic Persia. If the Iranian regime were to fall and a new government were to come into power, could there be some kind of peace treaty with Israel that could be called the Cyrus Accords? And that be the 7-year peace deal. So all those things are on the table. What we know from Scripture is that covenant for 1-7 is coming, that this final king of the north is going to be involved. He's going to affirm it, and that it's going to give Israel a sense of security in their own land. And I don't know if religious access to the Temple Mount will be involved in that treaty per se, but certainly there will be a recognition of the right of Jewish worship on the Temple Mount. So if you're following the wire, we're edging ever closer and closer to that as well, where there was a group of Levitical priests, trained priests in the modern Levitical priesthood that's being trained and raised up by the Temple Institute in Jerusalem right now. They actually went on the Temple Mount and prayed during this most recent Pesach, this most recent Passover. They didn't sacrifice a lamb, but they did pray. And so that's a big step for a group of, I've seen even groups of Israelis up on the Temple Mount that would, they're up there under guard by the Israeli Border Patrol, and they suddenly begin praying out loud and chanting. I've seen that before myself. But this is a next level thing where there's actually a group of priests who are dressed in their priestly garb that go up to perform a priestly service on the Temple Mount. So bit by bit, we're seeing more and more progress towards Jewish worship on the Temple Mount. So all these things are kind of coming together in our days. I really feel like this is the best information I've got of everything I've heard so far. Thank you, True Church Ministry, whoever you are. All right, guys. One more question. Do I think that the U.S. and Turkey and Syria will take out the current Iranian regime under Trump? Possibly. I don't know that there's going to be a hot war with Iran. Iran is very weakened right now. Iran certainly doesn't want to go to war with anybody right now. They are not in a position for a conventional war. And I doubt that Turkey really wants to go to war with Iran anyway. If you've noticed for the last 10 years, it's been war by proxy. We don't see the Iranian army marching across the border into Iraq and Syria. We see the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps kind of extending their tentacles in that country and raising up militias, proxy militias. And Turkey has done the same in Syria. So would Turkey and Iran go to war, like a conventional war with each other? I don't think either one of them want that right now. But, things changed on a dime. So a week from now, I could be proven wrong. But as it stands all I can say is as it stands right now, I don't see a conventional war to conquer Iran. Much more likely, I see the Iranian regime being weakened further and further by all of these developments. It's lost its most powerful proxy in Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been severely diminished. It's a shell of what it once was. Hamas has been gutted in Gaza, and now it's lost its most strategic ally in the region, which is Bashar al-Assad. And so Iran's in a bad place right now, and very weakened, and 90% of its own people hate the regime. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see the regime collapse. It wouldn't be much to knock it over. And I wouldn't be surprised if, I know for a fact, we know that Israelis the Mossad is working in Iran and has agents in Iran because they've done some dirty work there over the past few years. I wouldn't be surprised if the CIA and other intelligence organizations are working with some kind of underground resistance in Iran, if we wouldn't see some kind of coup eventually. I think that's probably the more likely scenario, but who knows? That's just, if I had to give it odds, that would be my over. My under would be a military invasion. Military invasions, as we've seen, I think everybody has learned in the last decade or 2 decades in the Middle East, invasions and military occupations and nation building is messy and expensive and not very successful. So it's much more successful if you find friendly allies on the inside and help them to give a push. Yeah. What I think we could be seeing in Iran right now is Iran has its back against its wall, and its ace in the hole, its trump card is its nuclear program. And I just read another report last week. Who knows if the CIA is right or not? The CIA has been wrong. The CIA didn't know, for instance, that Pakistan had a functional nuclear weapon in 2000, I think it was 99 actually, until they tested it. And Pakistan kind of surprised the whole world that they had a nuclear bomb. So we could all wake up one morning and find out that Iran has tested a nuke. Um, but for the most part, as far as the Israelis and Western intelligence agencies can tell right now, oh, hey, Shade, glad you could join us. As far as we can tell right now, Iran doesn't have a functioning nuke. They certainly have enough nuclear material, uranium, highly enriched uranium, to be able to build, they estimate now 12 nuclear weapons. And they could refine that uranium to weapons grade within a week. That's called the breakout period, right? How long would it take for you to be able to go from where you are to have a functioning nuke? That's your breakout period. Intelligence agencies are saying 2 weeks. Now, there's more to having a nuclear weapon than just the nuclear material. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, there were different teams that were doing different things. You have to have a team that builds a bomb, that ignites and causes the chain reaction in the nuclear material. So there are different teams that do have to do different things to have a functioning nuclear weapon. And as far as we can tell, Iran doesn't have that yet. But I can't imagine that they're not close. And at this point, that is their ace in the hole. They don't have much left to hang on to. And when you see North Korea, for instance, North Korea is also a very weak regime that is only propped up by its Chinese ally. And over the past 15, 20 years, its ace in the hole has been that it has nukes. It has nukes, and it has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can deliver those nukes to places in the world that we don't want them to go. So that changes the game, right? You can't just go in and have a conventional war with North Korea. Or they can launch a nuke into Europe or across the Pacific Ocean, potentially into the United States. So that's what Iran wants. It wants its security blanket, and its security blanket would be a nuclear weapon that's tipped on a ballistic missile that they could lob in the direction of Israel or in the direction of Europe, at least. All right, last question. My soul's delight. Daniel 8 does say, oh wait, that wasn't the question. There's a question I saw. You guys are very talkative. That's a good thing. Then I lose the questions. Anyway, Daniel 8. I think we talked a little about Daniel 8 last time. Do I see prophetic significance in the ram and goat war? Possibly. I'm just very on the fence about whether or not that's future or not. I know it does speak about being a passage for the time of the end. There are some other aspects in the way that the progression of Daniel's eschatological prophecies unfold. And the general tenor of those prophecies is that when you get to that little horn or that final king of the north character is when we start to look at it in a future sense. So I'm open. I don't like this word, but I'm agnostic. Okay, I won't say one way or the other. I'm open to it. And so a lot of this is just wait and see. I think if anybody comes out and says, I know what's going to happen. I see this happen on Twitter sometimes. These guys say, oh, well, this is that. And we know what's going to happen next. It's going to be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I would say in general, if somebody speaks like that, take what they say with a grain of salt. Nobody knows. The Lord doesn't intend us to know exactly how this is all going to unfold. If this is 3D chess, then he's the only one playing chess. Okay, he's the only conspirator in this conspiracy theory that's directing things behind the scene. And the enemy and the principalities and the powers and the human powers of this world have to act according to his direction. So ain't nobody know how this is going to go. We only know what the markers are. And so when we pass those markers, when we pass those checkpoints, we go, oh, that was it. There's the 70-year covenant. We passed that marker. Now we know who this man is. Now we know how much time we have. Now we can begin to read Daniel 11 and see what's going to unfold over the next 7 years and other prophetic passages. But we have to hit that marker first. And then the other big marker is obviously the one that Jesus talks about in Matthew 24:14, or Matthew 24, the abomination that causes desolation, the beginning of the great tribulation. That's the other great prophetic marker at the end of the age that we know 1290 days or 1260 or whatever it is, right? So we're in a race. We're racing along, and at some point we pass a marker and we go, oh, I recognize that landmark. Okay, we're here now. And until then, we just watch, pray, and wait. Alrighty, I think that's a good place to stop for today. Thanks again for sticking it out. I hope this has been edifying. What I'm praying is that this is edifying and encouraging to you, that you go away from these live streams with a new, I don't know, skip in your step, spiritually speaking. And it drives us more to prayer, drives us more to intercession, drives us more to engage with missions organizations and churches that are doing the hard work in the hard places of the world. And it drives us more to the Maranatha cry, come Lord Jesus, because that's really what we're looking for. One day the Antichrist is going to be laying in a mass grave, and Jesus in all his glory and power is going to be ruling from Jerusalem. And that will outstrip and outweigh all the things that we see happening in the world today. So take courage, saints. For the joy set before us, let us endure and carry our crosses until the end. And he who endures to the end will be saved. So love you all. Blessings to you. Keep the faith, keep the peace. Peace in the Middle East, as they used to say in the 90s when I was a kid. Maranatha.